One of the evolutionary advantages that human beings have is the fight or flight response. And what happens is when we have a threat, say a million years ago, there was some animal charging at us out of the undergrowth, and we had to just, at a moment's notice, we had to gear our bodies up to run or to resist. This was a fantastic capacity that allowed our human species to survive at that time. However, today it is doing us no good whatsoever because very few of us have wild animals running at us out of motel parking lots or out of work or wherever we are. Um, and so that very response of our body to make our muscles tense, to dilate our eyes, to shunt blood away from our gut into our extremities and so on, these are terrific, useful things in that circumstance. But all of that secretion of cortisol, adrenaline, and other stress hormones, when we're exposed to those things long term, have terrible effects in our bodies. I made a list a while back of all the bad effects that cortisol has if we're exposed to it long term. And it's things like a loss of bone density, a loss of muscle mass, hardening of the arteries in the brain, impaired learning. All these things are the result of chronic overstimulation of that fight or flight response. And so the way energy psychology works is that we seem to be able to very quickly take that response, that tense person, that emotional trauma, that body memory of emotional loss and trauma, and quickly deactivate that response. And what's happening biochemically is that the chemical cortisol, which is the cornerstone of that response, it helps us get ready to resist or to flee. The problem with cortisol secretion is that our body has to break down other helpful substances to make cortisol. So when we have a threat, we very, very quickly, within 1, 2, or 3 seconds, we quickly begin breaking down a really useful hormone to do with cell growth called DHEA, and we begin manufacturing cortisol. When we reverse the cycle and we reduce those emotional traumas and stresses, the reverse thing happens. We begin breaking down cortisol very, very quickly within 2, 3 minutes and building DHEA, which helps our cell growth. And low DHEA and a DHEA deficit is found in almost every disease. And part of it is that chronic stress eventually depletes our DHEA, which keeps our cells healthy, and disease then results. So in that way, emotional trauma and healing emotional trauma directly affects our physical health. One of the wonderful benefits of 20th century thought is a focus on the brain and mind and an expanding understanding of what the brain and the mind, how they interact and what they do. But we have tended to over-rely on models of the brain and the mind in healing. And the mind is very important in healing, but we tended as a society to neglect how important the body is in healing and in the mind. And especially the way memories are stored in the body. And we used to look for memories in the mind. We spent a century basically looking for how memory was stored and other aspects of mental function happened in the brain. And it turns out that many of them actually are stored in the body. And the first people to notice this were massage therapists. They found that as they would give people massages, just moving muscles and connective tissue around, that spontaneously they would remember emotional traumas, often from their past, early childhood. And suddenly this purely physical intervention of moving a muscle would cause a triggering of an emotional memory with an emotional trauma attached. And what EFT does is, by working directly with the muscle and the connective tissue, it releases the body memory. And when you release the body memory, suddenly that mental anguish and that emotional pain tends to shift. It's a quite remarkable thing. We can sometimes take a client who has not been helped by years and years and years of conventional psychotherapy, talk therapy, going through the mind, just talking about the heart, and we can do a purely mechanical physical intervention like tapping or rubbing some part of the body, and suddenly that whole pattern changes because it's being held in the muscles, in the energy field of the person, and when you change that level, suddenly the emotional resolution happens very quickly and naturally. That's a big question, and the degree of control that we have is much greater than we first imagined. We used to think that our genes contained the blueprints that describe the whole of how our lives were, our emotional lives and our physical characteristics and so on. And they do play a significant role, but a blueprint has to be read to be acted on. So just the way to build a building, the builders have to read the blueprint and then construct something. Our genes work the same way. Our genes are like blueprints, and what they build is proteins. And each gene, each length of DNA, each gene is responsible for coding for building a certain protein. And so cortisol is a protein, adrenaline is a protein. All of about 100,000 proteins our bodies use every second, and each of those is coded by a gene. And it turns out that those genes don't get activated until we have something telling them to do their work. And it turns out that, going further down the line, that our thoughts, our feelings, strong emotions, certain physical states, certain induced mental states, certain spiritual states actually affect the instructions being given as to which gene should be expressed and which proteins built and which ones not built. For example, there's a gene called HBDSC1 which actually builds cortisol, and so a signal has to go to that gene and that set of genes which tells it to break down DHEA and make cortisol. Now, who gives that signal? If you're sitting in your easy chair on a Sunday afternoon looking out at your backyard, it's a beautiful day, you got a glass of Coke in your hand, all is well with the world, you should be completely relaxed and making lots of DHEA. But if you're thinking stressful thoughts, if you're thinking, on Monday I go back to work and I have to confront Jack, that rotten boss of mine, and guess what? Sally, my wife, when I go to dinner, is probably going to have the same meatloaf we had last Thursday, and I don't like that meatloaf. If you're stressing yourself with those thoughts, what you're doing, there's no animal running at you from the savannah, but you are self-inducing stressful thoughts and shifting your production into making cortisol. Your body has no way of telling if there's an actual threat from out there, an objective threat, or whether this image of a threat, your boss or your wife or your child or whatever memory you have, this thing that you're generating within your own head, also your body reads that as a threat. So it shifts production from these healthful biochemicals, and the genes that manufacture stress chemicals are being told to, hey, turn on, there's a threat. So our cortisol level then elevates, and again we have all those negative effects of high cortisol. So we're learning that just having the blueprint doesn't mean the building's getting built. You have to tell that blueprint to get unwrapped and your body to then build the proteins that will create that effect before that happens. So in that sense, you have a lot of control over which genes are expressed and which aren't. And energy psychology techniques like EFT and TAT and others very, very quickly shift your production of cortisol by de-stressing you. You take somebody who's really highly stressed, all keyed up, all tense, reliving some old emotional wound, and suddenly you'll see within 2 or 3 moments they'll be completely relaxed. I've had clients at a workshop last week. I had a woman, and last month, she came up to the front of the room and asked for a volunteer, and she said, I'm a skeptic, I don't believe in this, and if you don't want to work on me, that's fine, I'll sit down again. But I am dealing with an emotional trauma. So there I'm in front of a room full of people, and this woman stands up and says she has an emotional trauma. Well, it's something I'd asked for someone with emotional trauma to deal with. And I said, what's your emotional trauma? She said, my son was abducted by guerrillas in Colombia, South America, and he was murdered by them. And it's the anniversary week of his death, of him being killed. And so this is clearly a serious trauma, a serious memory. So I asked her where this came to focus in her body. And she sort of took a moment to think about her body and how it felt. And that's an interesting thing we do in this kind of psychology. We have people focus not on what the memory is in your head, but where it comes to roost in your body. So she did a brief body scan and said, well, it's my left shoulder. And so I asked her to move her left shoulder. She said she couldn't. It was so painful and so frozen. Her whole shoulder joint was frozen up. So I asked her to tell us the story of her son's murder. She told us very briefly. And then I said, what was the key moment in that? Because I'm trying to find I can't work on the whole story and her whole relationship with her son in a 5-minute session in front of a group of people. So I tried to find the pivotal moment. And the pivotal moment was when the State Department called and told her son had been killed. That phone call was the critical memory for her. And so we did EFT, did some tapping. I did the first half of the EFT routine with her. And suddenly, she could move her arm. After the workshop, she walked up to me. She was swinging her arm around, round and round in big circles, and saying, I can't believe this. I just can't believe this. She was, But again, if I could have worked with her in psychotherapy for many, many hours to have the same effect, the same release, the same physical release, the same joy. When I asked her then to remember her son's death, and especially the phone call, she said she remembered it, and she said, but I think about the young man who called, and I think he was probably having a very difficult time telling me that. So for the first time, she could think not just of her own wounding and loss and suffering, she could think beyond that to the possible suffering of the person telling her the story on the other end of the line. So these sorts of breakthroughs are possible with physical interventions like EFT, and they aren't necessarily possible even with years of psychotherapy. So that's why body-centered work, looking at the body and releasing our stresses in the body, has such promise psychologically and for the healing of various kinds of illnesses. What studies have found, huge studies of many thousands of people, is that there's a significant correlation between early emotional trauma as children and adult disease. A huge study done of patients at Kaiser Permanente Hospital in Southern California had 17,000 people they studied. They looked at the link between early childhood adverse experiences and subsequent adult disease, and they found there was a huge link. If you had serious trauma in your childhood, you are 30 times more likely to attempt suicide than you are if you didn't have those serious traumas. More likely to smoke, more likely to have bone fractures, more likely to have high blood pressure, more likely to have cancer, more likely to have heart disease if you have these negative traumas as children. And we find, though, that we can release those memories, that the emotional impact of those memories can be released by working with these body-centered therapies. And that if you release those early emotional traumas, what should happen is that there should be a lesser incidence of all those diseases as adults, because we aren't holding those memory patterns stuck in our bodies anymore. Yes, and the question is, the problem is that people can use these techniques, experience temporary relief, but it may not last. And to use the example of the woman and her arm being frozen and her son's death, I worked only on one brief snippet of the experience, which was the phone call from the State Department official telling her son had been murdered. And we released the tension behind that, and that was her left shoulder. Now, other parts of her body had other tensions, many other tensions in them as well. And if I had worked with her long term, I would have worked on the whole series of experiences that led up to her son's death. I would also have worked on her son's relationship with her throughout her life, and incident by incident, I would have helped her release each of those things in her body too. Because it's not just her son's death, it's what it represents to her. Maybe she died with unfinished business. She hadn't told him she loved him. Maybe she was resistant to him going on that trip and they left on bad terms. She may have emotional stress about that. So just releasing the one incident doesn't release all of those things. You have to work intelligently over time. We've spent a lifetime accumulating these distresses and these emotional traumas. We can't just expect that in 3 minutes we'll drop them all. We can certainly drop one or two in a very brief time period. So I look for the pivot points, the most crucial points, because nibbling around the edges, you aren't going to get very far. You have to find the critical issues in the relationship or in the disease and try and release those. And then you work on the peripheral ones as well. But we're works in progress. We're human. Every day we have new traumas and new upsets and new problems we have to deal with. And so we need to be releasing those on an ongoing basis, as well as looking at the early childhood ones we can work on today. So in cases where you find people who appear not to heal or to heal and it's temporary, it's usually that they worked on part of the issue and there's just more of it coming up. Now, most of us, when we have a cold, a cough, a disease, a serious disease, we're tempted to think it's a misfortune, but it's not really a misfortune. It's really some part of our psyche, some old emotional wound, some physical issue popping up and saying, hey, pay attention to me, help me heal. Here I am showing myself to you in unmistakable form. And so whatever it is that seems to happen to us, it might seem like a random event or a bad misfortune to get a diagnosis of a disease, but if instead we see it as part of our unhealed business coming up to get finished and get addressed and get some attention, then when we get sick or when we get triggered, when we get upset, it's like, thank you. I have this thing to work on now. I have access to this traumatized part of myself, this poor little, this part of my inner child. But at 3 years old, I was really hurt by this horrible thing someone did to me. And now, guess what? I'm 50 years old. I'm 30 years old. And that little 3-year-old part of me is popping up again, maybe in the form of, outbreak of shingles or something like that, and saying, please pay attention to me. Here I am. And now we're 30. We're an adult. We can say, I love you. That's why we begin EFT by saying, even though I have this outbreak of shingles, I fully accept myself. We deeply accept ourselves with that condition. We don't make that 3-year-old wrong, for crossing the street or breaking the vase or whatever you did to get criticized by the adult. We first of all accept and love that part of ourselves. And there is healing power in love and acceptance like you would not believe. Just doing that, just saying, I love and accept myself. I mean, each of us should wake up every morning and say, look in the mirror and say, I love you, I accept you, I adore you, you're wonderful, and then see what comes up. Listen to the voices that say, no, you're not. You're a schmuck. You're wonderful. Who told you? Who do you think you are? And then listen to those voices and love those voices too. An extended circle of love. Again, do EFT with them, tap on them, release them. Then we move to this place of compassion and acceptance of our own weaknesses, of other people's weaknesses, and that's where all healing begins. Well, the law of attraction says that you get more of what you focus on. But denying something is focusing on it too. If I get sick and I stay in denial of my being sick, that's focusing on it by denying it. So by, for example, just say, for example, that I keep on hitting my shin against furniture. By saying I don't hit my shin against furniture, by denying it, by saying something that's obviously untrue. First of all, my left brain doesn't believe it because I do hit my shin on furniture all the time. And so by denying it, you're giving it negative attention and it'll persist as well. So I'm much more of a fan of saying I'm big, I'm strong, I can welcome this thing into my field of attention. Don't obsess about it, but it's coming up for healing. And if we attend to it, that symptom, that small symptom, the chances are quite good it'll heal. But if we suppress it or ignore it or say, oh, the law of attraction, I'll only focus on the positive, then we often are ignoring those areas of our lives and our characters that need real attention. And if we ignore them long enough, they begin as a little whispers saying, hey, pay attention to me, I'm here for healing. Eventually they're saying, hey, pay attention, your body needs some work right now. If we keep on ignoring those small symptoms and small issues, eventually our body is screaming and saying, hey, pay attention to me right now, or else. And then, suddenly we have some huge, hideous disease, which is presenting itself to us rather than the minor symptom we may have had earlier. So it really pays to welcome these as healing opportunities, not ignore them, not suppress them, not go, oh, woe is me. Just welcome them, accept them, and then see what we can do to shift them. About 60% of adults in America will develop back pain at some point in their lives. And the treatments as well medically for back pain are not very good, and most people have it recur. And there's not a lot medicine can do other than suppress the symptoms of painkillers. And occasionally they'll, in very extreme cases, people will have their nerves actually burned or cut or something like that to stop the pain happening. But we don't have to have good cures for back pain. Now, I happen to have an episode of back pain myself about 2 or 3 months ago. And so I had back pain. So I did some EFT, tapped on it, and my son's level of back pain, I think, was a 6. Again, subjective units of distress. We explain what we tell ourselves on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being really strong, 1 being really weak. Where am I right now? And I was about a 6 in terms of back pain. And so I did a full round of tapping, and after a round of tapping, I was at a 6. Again, did another round of tapping, I was still at a 6. Then I said, okay, what's the emotional issue behind the back pain? And I knew right away. When I asked that question, so when I did EFT for back pain, I had no change. When I looked at the emotional issue behind the back pain, for me the emotional issue was, the story was, I'm not being supported. Now again, our lower back is what supports our whole thoracic cavity and upper body. Our whole pectoral girdle, our heads, all of this hinges on that lower spine. So that is what supports us. And so my story was, I'm not being supported. Now I recognized right away, so I did a round of tapping on that, and the back pain went down to a 2 right away. And I realized as well that I'm very well supported. I have fabulous people all around me. Everyone I know loves and adores me and supports me to the max. And so logically it wasn't a very intelligent belief, but earlier on in my life and my work, I really wasn't very well supported by people. And I had to work on that pattern of believing I wasn't well supported. And a little echo of it came back, and it was back pain. So I released the emotional story, the old story, I'm not supported, released that with EFT, and the pain just resolved itself automatically. But again, if I'd suppressed it, if I'd gone to, say I'd gone to a doctor, I might have been prescribed physical therapy, I might have been given painkillers, various things might have happened. And in pain, there's an escalation of intervention. So a surgeon will try, or eventually try, more and more radical procedures to try and remove the pain. But the initial ones would probably have been physical therapy, maybe stretching, maybe a painkiller. But all of those things you can avoid by looking at the emotional issues and underlying it first. And occasionally there's just some organic disease. So it pays to see a doctor and rule out that this isn't a cancerous tumor growing on the side of your spine. It might be that as well. So it's well worth invoking the marvels of modern medicine as well and ruling out organic conditions. But people who go to a doctor, one study found that only 14% have an identifiable organic cause to their disease. The other 84% of doctors' visits, there is no obvious organic cause. So in at least 84% of cases, there's great room to do emotional release and see what the underlying emotional issues are that are coming out through that physical symptom, and then working with those. I used to hear a lot of explanations like subtle energy and metaphysical ones like energy bodies and angelic beings and entities from other dimensions and so on. Because these are very startling effects. When you watch somebody and you do a simple energy intervention and there's a radical change, it looks like magic. But, magnetism looked like magic to us when we first saw it. The internal combustion engine looked like magic to someone who only knew a horse-drawn cart. These things aren't actually magic. They're just areas that science hasn't yet fully explained. And people tend to be very impatient with science. But what's happened with EFT, energy psychology in general, is that experience with people, clinical experience, so this is clients in psychotherapists' offices, patients in doctors' offices, patients in hospitals, we see them healing very much more quickly than our medical model and our current psychological model would suggest. So it looks like magic. Just for example, I talked to a doctor called Chuck Gerber last week, and he had had a 92-year-old man come into his consulting room for a flu shot, just a routine flu shot. And the elderly people often do get flu shots because they want to make sure they don't get influenza. And the next day, the man came back to his office, and he had a large swelling on his arm where the flu shot had been. It was like an egg, Dr. Gerber said, underneath the man's skin, and it was angry and it was red. It was clearly inflamed. And so he prescribed the usual kinds of treatments for his patient. And as the patient was leaving, he suddenly thought, I'll try EFT. So he did some tapping with the man, and he said he couldn't believe it. The swelling just went down before his very eyes. This great big egg-shaped, angry, inflamed lump just was reabsorbed by the body very, very, very quickly. Again, things like cortisol are reabsorbed in 3 to 5 minutes. Some of the other inflammations can be reabsorbed very, very quickly by the body if they're treated in this way. So our medical models don't, when we look at these things medically, it looks like magic. But really, it's not magic, and there's excellent science behind why these things work. But it takes a while to do the studies and to learn exactly what is at work here. So initially, things happen, they look so startling, they don't fit into our models. We tend to just either dismiss them or ascribe them to angelic beings, and that's been an angel in the room or whatever. But eventually, bit by bit, science actually does describe to us how that magnet works. And it turns out to not be magic, it's a physical effect. And I urge people not to be impatient with science and scientists and researchers, because it takes years to get grants, to get funding, to design good experiments, to retest the experiments, to publish the results. And so in these kinds of frontier areas, published science tends to lag clinical experience in consulting rooms by at least 3 years, perhaps 5 years, perhaps 15 years. So my guess is by 2015, we'll know really well what's going on here scientifically, and you may have to be patient till then. We know now, today, there are some early experiments which do show us the effects of belief. One excellent series of experiments done by the University of Miami Stress Lab has shown that patients with certain beliefs, that a single belief by a patient can have a dramatic, these are AIDS patients being studied, can have a huge effect on the progression of AIDS in their bodies, and especially their count of white blood cells. White blood cells are what our body's immune systems use to repel invading organisms. And the researchers at the University of Miami found that with certain patients, their belief system, if they had certain beliefs, they had a much stronger and improving white blood cell count. Those with other beliefs had their white blood cell count dropped very fast. So a single belief, a single thought, a single idea can have an enormous effect on people's well-being. And so bit by bit, science will piece this together. Like we know, for example, about EFT, that the genes that govern the fight or flight response turn on within 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds of a thought. And these genes activate so quickly because they were required, again, for survival in the savannah 100 million years ago and 100,000 years ago. Our ancestors had to have genes that reacted very, very quickly and told our bodies to synthesize those stress chemicals that help us get out of a jam. So this was a totally useful thing way back when. And it's important to have these substances being synthesized by our bodies. But it's equally important for our long-term health that they be quickly reabsorbed and broken down again after a stress occurs. And the problem with modern life is we stress ourselves with our thoughts over and over and over and over again for hours and hours and hours on end. So suddenly we find ourselves having heart disease and having all these adverse effects of what's called chronic elevated cortisol production. And the trick with EFT and energy psychology is that it appears as though when we do these techniques, very quickly we stop producing a lot of cortisol, we release our stresses, and begin producing those helpful substances like DHEA instead. And so science is gradually measuring that. In fact, there's an experiment going on right now at Marshall University. We're taking 10 veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and we're doing EFT with them. We're measuring their level of cortisol and DHEA production before EFT and then after EFT. So we're doing a complete workup of what their normal rhythms of production. Because what you find with people with post-traumatic stress syndrome is they have elevated cortisol. They're in this constant hypervigilance. So their adrenal glands, which manufacture adrenaline, cortisol, are just being stimulated over and over and over again, day by day by day, month after month. But they're in this hypervigilant state, and they're using up all their body's reserves to produce these stress chemicals. What we expect to do through just 3 sessions of EFT is to permanently lower that baseline. And that's the hypothesis, that we will shift their baseline production of cortisol, and the experiment will tell us if in fact we're successful. So we've seen in the lab, and we've seen in doctors' offices, we've seen how people very quickly will go from that tense fight or flight state, their cheeks are flush, the muscles are tense, they're breathing shallowly, all those fight or flight symptoms that cortisol helps generate. We've seen that with EFT that they very quickly relax. So subjectively, in the doctor's office, we see this very quick reduction of the fight or flight response and that cortisol production. Now we need to test that experimentally by taking blood samples or saliva swabs and seeing if in fact their body chemistry is changing in the way it appears to be from clinical experience. One of the ways in which we can think of EFT being effective is that I call it a series of stress reduction gestures, naturally occurring stress reduction gestures. And what happens when people get an emotional shock? You know, we've all seen people, it's just so much part of our experience, we don't think twice about seeing people do these things. So you get some shocking news and someone says, or they get some kind of startled piece of information and they go, or you see someone resting their head in their hands when they're worried like this, or maybe they cross their arms when they're mad like this. And another one is the sharp intake of breath when we're startled. Now, if you look at what I just did, I just touched these points, these points, these points, this point, and these points. I've just basically, the other thing is, you know, people often nibble or push on their fingers like this. I've just touched most of the EFT points, because if you start to look for this, you will see people in bus stations, in restaurants, in classrooms. You'll see them sitting there going like this, or you'll see them doing a test and going like this. It is so natural that we've overlooked this obvious gesture, that series of gestures that people use all the time naturally to relieve stress. And what appears to happen with EFT is we simply, rather than doing these random gestures, EFT is just an organized routine for doing these gestures. You can either rub them or tap them, and you tap these points, but they're in a routine. And then the chances are 1 or 2 or 3 of those will release the muscular tension behind the stress. And so rather than just randomly expecting ourselves to remember to do those things, we just deliberately do them over the course of 20 or 30 seconds, and suddenly we basically, it's like hitting the emotional reset button. And you sit there, you feel a certain way, you do the reset wherever you tap on your body, and then you feel differently afterwards. And so doing these as a system is quite effective. But once you begin looking for people doing this, you'll see them doing it all over the place, all the time. Okay, why tapping on these points is important and makes a difference is because it affects our electrical body. Our electrical field of our heart, for example, extends about 15 feet away from our bodies. It's a big, strong electrical field. It was discovered in the 1920s by a Dutch physician called Willem Einthoven. and he got the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1924 for discovering the heart's electrical field. And so these fields have been well known for many, many, many decades so far. And these points that I've been pointing out here, these acupressure points, are unusual in that at the center of an acupressure point, the electrical charge is about 1/2000th of the electrical charge of the surrounding skin. In other words, the resistance of these points of very, very, very low electrical resistance. So our skin has a certain baseline resistance overall, but there are certain like portals where the resistance is very low and where a charge can travel very, very quickly. What happens when I tap at some point on my body, especially one of those points of low resistance, is that a very small electrical charge travels through my connective tissue and my muscles, but the connective tissue especially, to other points in my body. It's called piezoelectricity, and piezoelectricity is distinguished, it's done by friction. Anytime you tap, a massage is a piezoelectric experience. When you rub a muscle or move a muscle, or even just exercise, it's generating piezoelectric charges in your body. And an example from outside the body is when you turn on your oven in your house, you turn the knob or you push the button, there's a click, 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 and then the gas comes on. That's a piezoelectric element. It's a ceramic element with a metal striker, and it strikes it mechanically, but the mechanical act of striking creates an electrical charge which then ignites the burners on your gas stove. So that's a common example. There are lots of examples from automotive engineering, from electronic devices we have in our home. Piezoelectricity is used in industry extensively. And the way it works in healing is when we tap or rub or move two surfaces against each other, there are these small piezoelectric charges we generate, and they travel to places in our body. And the likely pathway they take is our connective tissue. Our connective tissue is a series, is built up of collagen fibers, and collagen fibers function as a liquid crystal. They're highly regular arrays of molecules, and they transmit these impulses, these waves, all over the body at very, very rapid speeds. The speed of signaling through collagenous tissue is much, much, much faster than through our neural system. So, for example, experimenters have stimulated the acupuncture points in the feet. And when they do that, the occipital part of the brain, which has to do with vision, when they stimulate the acupressure points in the feet that have to do with vision, the brain lights up in the vision part of the brain much faster than nerves can conduct the information up there. And the probable way this is happening is the connective tissue is sending these very, very fast electrical impulses. It's just like if I have to open my car door, I have a car key, I also have a little clicker, and either I can use a mechanical form of signaling to open my car door, and that's your neurons do that. This is electromechanical signaling. So that's like me walking over with my car key and sticking it in the lock and turning the lock, and then opening the car door and putting the key in the ignition and turning it on. But an electrical signal is clicking and the car unlocks like that. So our electrical signals are very, very quick in our body, whereas our mechanical signals, like our nerve signaling, which is a process of the transfer of sodium and chloride ions chemically across the surface of nerve cells, that is a much slower way of signaling. So we find that when we do things like piezoelectric charges by tapping, those signals move very, very quickly. And they also move electrically in the sense that a diseased organ and a diseased cell has a different electrical charge, a very different electrical charge very often, than a healthy organ. And so my speculation is that when we generate these small electrical charges, they're traveling through our bodies, through these pathways of maximum conductance in our skin, to the areas in our bodies that are traumatized and have different electrical charges, and is affecting the charge of the organ. And that's where the healing effect lies. Now again, I need to stress this is an unproven hypothesis. I'm hypothesizing this in my new book, The Genie in Your Genes, and we'll have to do a lot more testing before we know if this is the mechanism. But it's one of the likely mechanisms, is these piezoelectric charges caused by tapping the surface of the skin at acupressure points, which are these very, very low resistance points in the skin, generate piezoelectricity which travels through the connective tissue body to the place of maximum distress in the system. Another aspect of this medicine is an aspirin. Modern medicine looks for a molecule to affect another molecule. So when you get a prescription, it's a particular kind of substance designed to affect a particular target in the body. And the old metaphor is that cancer cures look for the magic bullet. The magic bullet is the magic molecule that will affect just the cancer cell and nothing around it. But in fact, our bodies don't work that way. They work as systems. Our organ systems are entire systems of organs. And so energy psychology appears to work systemically in our bodies. So rather than just an aspirin, which is a single chemical target, we in fact can be having well-being effects far beyond the one little condition we have. For example, somebody, say, who comes into treatment and has one single area that's bothering them, when we treat that through energy psychology, we often find that other aspects of their life improve. Maybe their work life improves. Maybe their athletic performance improves. So when you treat people systemically and holistically, when you change the energy of any one part of a system, it changes the whole system. It's like if you look at iron filings around a magnet. If you change the charge or change the field in just one tiny area, the whole field changes. And it's the same way with the human body. When you change the electrical system of the whole body, of one part of the body, the whole part of the body is affected. That's why healing can occur in this fairly global sense. As we get used to being unstressed and well, we find that the effects travel to all of our parts of our lives. One study looked at the electrical charges of women with uterine cancer or precancerous conditions in the uterus, and it found they had a negative electrical charge, whereas the uterus as a whole has a positive electrical charge. And we're finding that electrical charges throughout our bodies have an effect on healing. Another example is that Dr. Robert Becker, starting in the late 60s and through the 70s and 80s, began to experiment with passing very small electrical currents through healing bones. And he found that certain currents had an effect on bone healing. And now it's a standard part of the practice of medicine to pass these very, very fine currents through bone fractures sometimes, and it affects the healing, it speeds up the healing of bones. So in many ways, we realize we're electrical beings, and when we tap, we generate these very small electrical charges which then affect different parts of our body, especially the organs that are in the maximum state of distress. And we can change the charge slightly on those organs, and they may only need a tiny nudge toward healing to start to heal. So often our bodies have a natural healing cycle. It actually takes a lot to interfere with that body's natural healing cycle. And it may take only a little bit of a shift toward healing for the body to then naturally kick in with its full range of healing skills and abilities. There have been several studies done of the number of deaths and injuries caused by medical practice in the US, and the most conservative estimate comes from the Journal of the American Medical Association, and they estimate that about 250,000 people, 250,000 people, die each year from medical treatment. And very few of these are actually medical errors. Most of them are things like infections picked up in hospitals. You're in a place where there are a lot of sick people, and the chances are much higher you'll pick up a serious infection in a hospital despite all the effects to stifle those infections. Plus, because they've used so many kinds of chemicals to kill infections, what survives is the antibiotic resistant strains of those organisms. And so you're more likely to find in a hospital the antibiotic resistant strains of an organism than you are in everyday life. The other figure comes from a very careful survey of government documents, And it actually showed that there are about 750,000 people every year, 750,000 who die from the medical system. And the truth may be somewhere in between that. But the bottom line is going into a hospital and looking for conventional medical treatment, this is a wonderful resource we have in our society, but people tend to overuse it and go there first. And what my work is all about is trying to encourage them to first of all look for the self-healing intervention. What can you do? What lifestyle change can you make? What change in your belief can you make that will support your health? What energy psychology, energy medicine? These are non-invasive. They're often free. They're all very, very, very cheap. And for example, the woman I described with the frozen shoulder, she could have had an operation to free that shoulder that cost $85,000. And I'll give you one example. Dr. Bruce Moseley at Baylor University Medical Center in Texas did a study comparing two kinds of knee surgery. And those two kinds of knee surgery are called debridement and lavage. And a very small incision is made in the side of the knee, each side of the knee, and then in debridement, the dead tissue is scraped away. In lavage, a very strong current of water is shot through the knee joint, which cleans out the knee capsule. And he was a good scientist, and so he had a third control group, and the third group got neither debridement nor lavage. They got a fake operation, a placebo operation. So they were wheeled into the operating theater, and the staff made two little cuts on the side of their knees, just the way they would if they were doing a real operation. The staff then shuffled around the operating theater for 45 minutes like they were doing a real operation, but did nothing to the person's knees, and then sewed up their knees again. And they then monitored which group, because they're wondering, does debridement work best or does lavage work best? What they found was that at several stages of the healing process, the patients who got the fake operation did as well or better than those who got either procedure, and just the patient's belief that they could heal was effective. One old man I remember seeing in a video after the operation, he swore he'd got the real operation. He said, "Oh, before this operation, I was using a walker. I could hardly move, and I've been walking miles a day since that. Thank you, Dr. Moseley." And then they just discovered it was a fake operation. He couldn't believe he was one of the fake operation groups. So just the belief that something has happened can make a huge difference. So I encourage people, use belief, use thought, use intention, use prayer, use all these things. If they all fail, by all means, go and get drugs and surgery. But the first thing you should do, what can I do? What can my church do? My spiritual counselor, my family, how can they support me? Where can I find love? Where can I find self-acceptance? Try those things. Try them first, try them often, try them with medical treatment, because the resources of our bodies, our hearts, our minds, our spirits, our souls to heal are so vast that if we leave those out of the healing equation, we have neglected 90% of our possible resources. So welcome, and I think biomedicine is fabulous. I'm glad we have it, but if that's where we go first, we are really missing the bulk of the healing picture, which is self-healing. My best guess right now as to where this field will go in the next decade. And it isn't all sunshine and roses, unfortunately. Again, we're seeing in clinics, we're seeing with cancer treatment, we're seeing with heart disease, we're seeing especially with autoimmune diseases, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, things like that. We're seeing patients get well at a staggering rate using energy psychology and EFT. Again, the doctor who had the 92-year-old man who got a flu shot reaction, he did EFT with him and he just watched it go away. He said to me, "I can't tell my colleagues about this. They'd never believe me." He said, "I don't even believe what's happening before my very eyes. How can I expect other people to believe this?" And that was my response. When I first saw EFT, I was taught EFT by a Gestalt therapist. And I'd love to be able to say that I responded with scientific detachment and impartiality, but I responded with dismissive scorn, I said, there's no way that can possibly happen. What I saw happen before my eyes could not possibly have happened. But after you've seen it a few times, you realize that there are remarkable healing stories that come out of this. So this may be the most important new therapy to arrive in both medicine and psychology for a century. It is a remarkable healing breakthrough. And let's be clear about this. This is a radical, discontinuous change in our ability to stimulate our innate ability to heal, natural ability to heal. It's to sort of take these stress reduction gestures and organize this very simple, non-invasive, safe technique anyone can do anytime is a remarkable advance. And what has happened is that groups have lined up in favor of the advance and against the advance, and a lot of people have tried to grab it and make it theirs, make proprietary brands of energy psychology and exclude others from the field, and there's all kinds of politics in it, all quite nasty. And it's such a powerful thing, though. It is going to very, very quickly make inroads. As we're doing studies, for example, there was just a big study released by Kaiser Permanente in Oregon, people doing TAT, another energy psychology technique, for weight loss. And it showed that it was terrific for weight loss. So once we begin to realize how it can affect all these other conditions, which are very, very hard to treat sometimes with other modalities, the field is going to explode. I expect to be training thousands of psychiatrists and doctors myself in the next few years as the potential of this becomes obvious. But I expect there to be a major conflict between HMOs and drug companies over this technique, because if I'm a member of Kaiser Permanente and I'm paying my $300 a month, whether I'm sick or well, Kaiser has a big stake in helping me get well. So Kaiser wants me to take yoga classes, Kaiser wants me to take drug counseling classes, Kaiser wants me to take exercise classes, they want me to take yoga and Tai Chi, because they know, they'll give me all these things for free. They know if I do all these things for self-care, including this sort of work, that I'll be better, and that I'm still paying my $300 a month into their system, but I'm not using it because I'm so healthy, you know. So they have a vested interest in techniques that make people well, like EFT. The drug companies, on the other hand, have the opposite interest. Their financial success depends on doctors prescribing large amounts and multiple medications to people. And so there are these two tectonic forces which will collide in the next decade. The HMOs, which are heavily invested in wellness, and the drug companies that are heavily invested in illness. And I expect there'll be studies trying to disprove this work. There'll be a lot of political opposition to it at some point. I think it will prevail because it's so manifestly, it's safe, it's non-invasive, it's low-tech, people can do it. There's no client-patient relationship that is a power over struggle. There are all kinds of advantages. I mean, children can do it. You can do EFT badly and have an effect. You can do EFT and not believe in it and have an effect. And that's remarkable because we count on the placebo effect, the effect of belief, like the arthroscopic surgery people who had their knees worked on. We know that belief really helps the healing process. But I can take somebody who does not believe this will work and a person treating them who doesn't believe it'll work, and it'll still work. So it's a remarkable low-tech therapy. So for all those reasons, I think it'll really catch on in the next 10 years or so. It'll be used in hospitals. It'll be used as a first line of defense. It'll be used in schoolrooms. It'll be used in prisons. I mean, think about gang members who are prone to sudden outbursts of violence. I have one colleague uses it in reform schools with juvenile offenders. They do this, and it diffuses all of their anger and all of their stress. So it's going to be widely applied, I believe, in schools, in classrooms, in prisons, institutionally, and it's going to have a huge group of people that adopt it and a big scientific base very, very quickly. There are already a lot of studies showing that this works and works very effectively for various conditions, and that will only grow. But there will be a backlash, and then eventually it'll become accepted. So I think that some famous philosopher once said that first they ridicule you, then they fight you, then they scorn you, then you win. So, what I recommend is whatever your condition, whatever you're dealing with in your life, mental, emotional, or physical, just try it. It can do nothing to hurt you and possibly a lot to help.